The dust of Wyoming had a taste. It was gritty, dry, and red, a fine powder that settled on everything, a constant reminder that life in Dry River was a battle against thirst. In the year 1889, the town itself was little more than a collection of weary wooden buildings clinging to the edge of the Union Pacific tracks, a temporary pause in the vast, unforgiving landscape. Heat shimmered off the rails, making the horizon dance and distort. For Eli McRae, that horizon was both a fence and a memory. At 35, Eli wore the silence of the high plains like a second skin. His shoulders, broad from years of ranch work and a past he rarely spoke of, were set with a cavalryman's discipline. He stood on the station platform, a solitary figure in a town stirred into a rare frenzy by the approaching train. His face was weathered, mapped with the lines of sun and wind, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. He was here to collect a parcel, though this one had a name and, he hoped, a future, a mail-order bride. The very words felt foreign on his tongue, a desperate gamble for a man who had forgotten the shape of softness. His ranch, the Circle M, was a testament to his hard work, but the silence in his cabin had grown louder than any coyote's howl. He wanted a family, a reason to build beyond mere survival. The whistle shrieked, a long, mournful cry that cut through the dry air. Smoke billowed, black against the pale blue sky, and the great iron engine hissed to a stop, its massive wheels groaning. Doors clattered open, and people spilled out onto the platform, drummers with their sample cases, families squinting in the unfamiliar brightness, rough men looking for work or trouble. Eli's gaze scanned the faces, searching for the one from the faded photograph in his coat pocket, a woman named Sarah Hart, with gentle eyes and a shy smile. Then he saw her, or rather, he saw the woman who must be her. She stood apart from the others, holding a single worn carpet bag. She was younger than the photograph suggested, perhaps 24, with dark hair pulled back severely, revealing a face of striking, quiet composure. She was not beautiful in the way of saloon girls, but there was an intelligence in her steady gaze, a calm that seemed out of place amidst the station's chaos. As she drew closer, he saw a thin, silvery scar just below her ear, a delicate line against her pale skin. Her eyes, a deep, thoughtful brown, met his, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. This was Lila Hart. Before either of them could speak, a portly man in a city suit stepped between them, blocking her path. Ward Collins, the owner of the bank, the saloon, and half the land in Dry River, smiled a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Well now," Collins boomed, his voice oozing a false cordiality that set Eli's teeth on edge. "The final piece of merchandise has arrived. I trust your journey was satisfactory, my dear." Lila's posture stiffened. She did not flinch, but a shudder seemed to come down behind her eyes, her gaze becoming distant. She looked straight ahead, her silence a shield against the man's oily tone. The crowd, sensing a spectacle, began to press closer. Collins chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "A bit quiet. Is she no matter? McRae, I trust my fee is in order. Finding suitable companionship for discerning gentlemen is a delicate business. One must ensure the quality of the goods." He ran his eyes over Lila in a way that made Eli's hands clench into fists. He was talking about her as if she were a head of cattle he had procured at market. He made a show of flicking a piece of dust from his lapel, though this one seems to have seen some travel. One hopes her history is not as worn as her luggage. The insinuation hung in the air, thick and foul. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Eli felt a familiar, cold anger rise in his chest, the kind he had learned to master long ago. He took a deliberate step forward, placing himself between Collins and the woman. He was not as tall as the banker, but he was made of whipcord and steel, and his stillness held more menace than Collins's bluster. "Your business here is done," Collins, Eli said, his voice low and even. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, tossing it to the banker. The coins clinked with finality. That settles our account. Collins caught the pouch, his eyes narrowing. So eager to claim your prize. Be careful, McRae. Sometimes a bargain is not what it appears to be. Contracts have specific terms, specific names. This woman is with me, Eli repeated, his gaze unwavering. He turned his back on Collins, a calculated dismissal, and looked at Lila. Miss Hart, I am Eli McRae. For the first time, she looked directly at him, and he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Gratitude mixed with a deep, guarded sorrow. Mr. McRae, she said, her voice softer than he expected, but clear and steady. He took her bag from her hand. The handle was smooth from use. The wagon is this way. It is a long ride to the ranch. He led her through the parting crowd, the whispers following them like buzzing flies. He was acutely aware of her walking beside him, her head held high, refusing to acknowledge the stares and murmurs. She moved with a purpose that surprised him. She was not a wilting flower. They reached his wagon, a sturdy buckboard hitched to a pair of strong chestnuts. He placed her bag in the back and turned to help her up, but she was already climbing aboard, her movements deft and sure. He tied his horse, a powerful gray gelding, to the tailgate and climbed up beside her. He clucked to the team, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the station and its judgments behind in a cloud of red dust. They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic plodding of the horses' hooves. The town of Dry River was a hard place, and he knew what people would be saying. A mail-order bride was always an object of gossip, a woman assumed to be running from something. Collins had just given them a story to chew on. Finally, as the last buildings of the town gave way to the open, rolling hills, she spoke. "Thank you," she said, not looking at him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "He had no right," Eli said gruffly. "Men like Mr. Collins believe their money gives them every right." Her voice was devoid of self-pity, a simple statement of fact. He risked a glance at her. Her profile was etched against the vast landscape, her expression unreadable. He had expected tears, perhaps, or anger. Instead, there was a profound stillness about her, a resilience that was as plain as the scar on her neck. They came upon the stockyards on the edge of town, a chaotic maze of pens and fences where cattle bawled and men shouted. Eli slowed the team, needing to speak to a rancher about a stray bull. As he pulled the wagon to a halt near a trough, he caught sight of two men lounging by the fence. He recognized them instantly as hands who did Collins's dirtier work. They were speaking in low tones, but the dry air carried their words. "Collins is furious. Says the contract was for a Sarah Hart. This one's name is Lila," one of them said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "So what is the difference?" the other asked. "The difference is the contract is void. Collins wants her back, says she is his property until the paperwork is corrected. We are to repossess her when McRae is not looking." A cold dread settled in Eli's gut. This was not just about a fee or a breached contract. Collins wanted to control her, to own her. The word property echoed the banker's sneer at the station. He looked at Lila. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the two men. She had heard them. Too. Fear, raw and real, had finally broken through her composure. Eli made his decision in a heartbeat. There was no time for discussion, no time for weighing options. There was only the immediate, undeniable threat. "Hold on," he said, his voice a low command. He untied his gray from the tailgate in two swift motions, swung himself out of the wagon and into the saddle. He nudged the horse alongside the buckboard, reaching down. "What are you doing?" Lila whispered, her eyes wide. "There is no time," he said, his voice tight. "Give me your hand." She hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in his. He pulled, and she scrambled from the wagon's seat. Surprisingly light, and he settled her in front of him on the saddle. He wrapped one arm securely around her waist, pulling her tight against his chest. She felt small and fragile, but her back was ramrod straight. He wheeled the horse around, away from the stockyards, away from the town. He urged the gelding into a canter, then a gallop, leaving the wagon and the two startled men behind. A fine misty rain had begun to fall, turning the red dust to a dark, clinging mud. It was not a storm, just a persistent drizzle that blurred the edges of the world, washing the air clean. They were on the same path now, two strangers on a single horse, riding away from a town that had already judged them, galloping headlong into an unknown future. The pounding of the horse's hooves was a drumbeat against the silence. He could feel her trembling slightly, whether from fear or the chill in the air. He could not tell. After several miles, when the stockyards were just a distant memory, he slowed the horse to a walk, letting it catch its breath. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the whisper of the rain and the creak of saddle leather. He had 1,000 questions. Who was she? Why had she come under her sister's name? What trouble was she running from that had followed her all the way to Wyoming? But he asked none of them. Right now, all that mattered was that she was here, and he had given his word, even if it was to a woman in a photograph. It was Lila who finally broke the quiet. Her voice was barely audible above the rain. The woman in the picture, her name was Sarah. She was my sister. Eli said nothing, just kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his arm a steady presence around her. She passed a month before I was to leave, Lila continued, her words coming in a rush, as if a dam had broken. She was sick for a long time. The letters you received, I wrote them for her. She dictated them at first, but then it was just me. I wrote what I thought she would want to say. I knew it was wrong, but she had such hope. She saw your advertisement, and she believed it was a sign, a way out for us. When she was gone, I did not know what else to do. Her ticket was paid for. The promise had been made. I thought I could come and make it right. I could work. I could be a good wife. I could honor the promise she could not keep. She fell silent, her confession hanging between them in the damp air. She had lied, deceived him from the very beginning. He should have been angry. He should have felt cheated. He had sent for a wife, not a web of secrets and a feud with the most powerful man in the county. He should turn the horse around, take her back to town, and wash his hands of the whole affair. But as he felt the slight tremor that ran through her, he thought of the quiet dignity with which she had faced Collins, the raw fear in her eyes at the stockyards, and the simple, desperate honesty in her voice now. She was not asking for charity. She was offering to pay a debt with her own life. He looked down at the top of her head, where the rain was gathering in her dark hair. He thought of his empty house, of the silence that ate at him day after day. He had taken a gamble on a photograph, on a set of carefully penned words. The reality was far more complicated. But it was also real. This woman beside him was not a phantom from a letter. She was flesh and blood, a person in trouble who had, for better or worse, thrown her lot in with his. Eli McRae was a man who understood duty. He had seen it betrayed on the battlefield and had lived with the ghosts of those failures. He would not betray it now. He finally spoke, his voice rough but clear above the sound of the rain. "A promise is a promise," he said slowly, looking out at the endless gray plains stretching before them. "It seems you are here to keep one. I suppose I should do the same?" He felt her exhale, a long, shuddering breath of relief. She leaned back against him, just for a moment, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them. The rain fell harder, washing the dust from the air, and together they rode on toward the Circle M. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger from men like Collins and the secrets she still carried. But for the first time in a long time, Eli was not riding alone. The Circle M Ranch was not a place of gentle beauty. It was carved out of a landscape of stark contrasts, rolling hills the color of cured leather, a sky so vast it seemed to press down on the earth, and a wind that never truly stopped, whispering through the dry buffalo grass with a lonely sound. The cabin was built of solid, axe-hewn logs, chinked tight against that wind. It was a structure of pure function, with a sturdy barn standing nearby and a stone-lined well that was the ranch's lifeblood. To Lila, stepping down from Eli's horse, it looked like the loneliest place in the world, but it also looked safe. The inside of the house smelled of wood smoke, old leather, coffee, and dry grass. It was a man's space, tidy and disciplined, but devoid of any softness. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A simple plank table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the main room, and a narrow bed occupied a far corner. A closed door, she presumed, led to a bedroom. There were no curtains on the windows, only the endless land staring back in. "You can take the bedroom," Eli said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet. He set her bag down by the door. "I will sleep out here." His offer was simple, a statement, not a request. He moved to the stove, his motions economical and practiced, and began to build up the fire. Lila stood uncertainly in the middle of the room, feeling like a misplaced piece of furniture. She was here to be his wife, yet they were more like strangers forced to take shelter together. She pushed down the feeling of unease. She had made a promise, and she would keep it. The next few days unfolded in a quiet rhythm of discovery. Lila learned the geography of her new life, the path to the deep well, the cool darkness of the root cellar, the warmth of the barn where the animals shifted and snorted contentedly. She was determined to prove her worth, to show Eli she was more than the sum of her deceptions. Her first attempt at baking cornbread, however, was a disaster. Used to a different kind of oven, she produced a skillet of what looked and smelled like a blackened stone. She was standing over the stove, staring at her failure with a mortified expression. When Eli came in from the barn, he stopped and looked at the smoking skillet, then at her. A long moment passed. She braced herself for criticism, for a reminder of her inadequacy. Instead, he walked to the stove, took a knife, and chipped off a piece of the black crust. He examined it with the seriousness of a geologist studying a rock. "Well," he said, his voice perfectly level, "it would probably stop a bullet." Lila stared at him, and then she saw it. A faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, a glint of humor in his storm-gray eyes. A small laugh escaped her, a sound of pure surprise. "I am so sorry," she said. "I can make bean soup. I am good at that." "Bean soup sounds fine," he said, tossing the piece of char into the wood box. The brief, shared moment of humor felt more intimate than any conversation they had had so far. Her bean soup was, in fact, perfect, thick, savory, and nourishing. It was the kind of food that fortified a man against a hard day's work. As they ate in the flickering lamplight, a comfortable silence settled between them. She was learning that Eli was not a man of many words, but his actions spoke a clear language. Her true value, however, was revealed a week later. A young filly, barely a year old, had gotten tangled in some loose wire near a creek bed and had badly sprained her foreleg. The horse was in pain, hobbling and favoring the limb, her eyes wide with fear. Eli examined the swelling with a grim expression. "It is not broken, but it is a bad twist," he said, his voice tight with concern. "She will be lame for a long time, if she heals at all." Lila came closer, her movements slow and calming. She spoke to the filly in a low, soothing voice, running a gentle hand down its neck. The horse, sensing her quiet confidence, stopped trembling. "Let me see," Lila said softly. Eli stepped back, surprised, but allowed her to take his place. Lila knelt in the dirt, her hands moving over the horse's leg with an expert touch that was both firm and gentle. She felt the heat of the swelling, the tightness of the tendons. "I need clean cloths, hot water, and some fresh sage, if you have any," she said, her focus entirely on the animal. Eli hesitated for only a second before turning to do as she asked. He watched, fascinated, as she worked. She steeped the sage leaves in the hot water, creating a fragrant poultice that she wrapped around the filly's leg to draw out the swelling. Then, with strips of a torn flour sack and 2 carefully shaped pieces of wood from the kindling box, she fashioned a sturdy, effective splint. Her hands were sure, her knots were tight, and her calm demeanor never wavered. The filly stood still for her, as if it understood it was being helped. When she was finished, she stood and wiped her hands on her apron. "We need to keep her penned and quiet for a few weeks. Change the poultice twice a day. She will heal." Eli looked from the perfectly splinted leg to Lila's face, smudged with dirt but serene. He had seen army surgeons with less skill. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, a note of genuine awe in his voice. "My father was a veterinarian. Back east," she said simply. "I was always his shadow." In that moment, Eli's perception of her shifted. This was not just a desperate woman running from her past. She was skilled, knowledgeable, and possessed a strength he was only beginning to understand. He had sent for a wife, a companion to fill the silence. He had received something more. He had received a partner. That night, after the quiet supper, he unrolled his bedroll on the floor of the main room as he had every night since she arrived. Lila went into the bedroom and closed the door. But as Eli lay in the dark, listening to the wind outside, he got up and walked to the kitchen door, which led outside. He opened it just a crack, enough to let in a sliver of moonlight, enough that it would not be truly locked. He did it without thinking, an old soldier's instinct to provide a line of retreat, to ensure the person under his protection did not feel trapped. In the bedroom, Lila heard the soft creak of the door. She lay awake, her own secrets a heavy weight in her chest. Eli's quiet decency was a constant, painful reminder of her own dishonesty. Every act of kindness, every shared glance of understanding, made her fear the eventual revelation of the whole truth even more. She was terrified that the respect she was beginning to see in his eyes would turn to contempt when he knew everything. She had seen the way his jaw tightened when he thought of Collins and his deceit. What would he do when he knew the full extent of hers? The early summer was dry, the rains that had greeted her arrival a distant memory. The grass in the pastures turned from green to pale gold, and the creek shrank to a trickle. One morning, Eli announced they would have to move a portion of the herd to the higher grazing lands where the grass was still good. They worked together, side by side, riding out into the vast emptiness of the range. Lila was a capable rider, and she followed his directions with a quiet competence that made the work go faster. As they paused on a high ridge to let the cattle graze, she saw it in the distance, a thin, dark line stretching across the plains, glinting in the sun where it was strung between poles, a telegraph wire. A sudden coldness washed over her, and she instinctively pulled her horse's head around, turning her back to it as if it were a snake. Eli noticed the small, sharp movement. He saw the way her shoulders tensed and the color drained from her face. He did not say anything, but he filed the observation away. It was another piece of the puzzle of Lila Hart, a woman who could calm a frightened horse but was herself spooked by a simple wire. There was someone she did not want to be found by, someone from whom even this remote corner of Wyoming might not be far enough away. Later that afternoon, as they were brushing down the horses in the barn, a strand of her dark hair came loose from its bun, falling across her face. She impatiently tried to tuck it back, her fingers clumsy from a long day of riding. "Here," Eli said, his voice startlingly close. He stepped behind her. She froze as she felt his large, calloused hands gather her hair. She expected him to be rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He began to braid her hair, his movements slow and deliberate. "I braid the horse's mane sometimes," he explained, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "Keeps them from getting tangled in the brush." His fingers were not as nimble as a woman's, and the braid was a bit lopsided, but it was firm and secure. The simple, domestic act was so unexpected, so tender, that a warmth spread through her chest. When he was finished, he rested his hands on her shoulders for just a second. "There," he said. She turned to look at him, and a genuine smile touched her lips. He looked down at his handiwork, then at her smiling face, and he smiled back, a rare, unguarded expression that transformed his rugged features. They both started to laugh, a soft, shared sound that filled the dusty quiet of the barn. That evening, as she hung her bonnet on a peg by the door, she saw it next to his worn, sweat-stained hat. The two shapes on the wall were so different, one representing a life of hard sun and open spaces, the other a life of shaded rooms and quiet endurance. Yet here they were, hanging side by side, casting two distinct shadows that merged into one on the log wall. They were building something here, she realized, a fragile trust made of small, unspoken things. A door left open, a skillfully set splint, a clumsy braid, a shared laugh. It was a foundation of mutual respect, and it was becoming more precious to her than the safety she had originally sought. And that made her even more afraid of the storm her secrets were sure to bring. The peace of the Circle M was a fragile thing, a bubble of quiet in a world that was growing loud. When Eli and Lila rode into Dry River for supplies, they felt the change immediately. It was not in what was said, but in what was not. Conversations that had been lively moments before would hush as they passed. Men who had once offered Eli a nod of greeting now found something fascinating to study in the dust at their feet. Women would draw their children closer, casting sidelong glances at Lila, their eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and pity. The air itself seemed thick with whispers. Ward Collins had been busy. He had taken the spark of gossip from the train station and fanned it into a fire, poisoning the town's well of public opinion with insinuation and outright lies. He painted Lila as a con artist, a woman of low character who had deceived an honest rancher. He did it with a concerned sigh and a shake of his head, cloaking his malice in the guise of civic duty. The one island of warmth in this sea of cold shoulders was the boarding house run by May, a woman whose broad smile was as sturdy as her frame. She saw them tying up their wagon and bustled out, wiping her hands on her apron. "Eli, Lila," she said, her voice a welcome balm. She ignored the watching eyes and gave Lila's arm a comforting squeeze. "Pay them no mind. Their opinions are as thin as ditch water." She lowered her voice slightly. "Collins has been telling anyone who will listen that you are some kind of runaway swindler. Says he is protecting the town's virtue. That man would not know virtue if it bit him on his fat nose." Just then, Deputy Sheriff Hayes approached, his steps hesitant. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, with a sincere face that was currently clouded with unease. He stopped before them, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "Eli." "Ma'am," he stammered, I have to ask. Mr. Collins has lodged an informal complaint about the contract you had for passage." Eli's face hardened, but his voice remained level. "My business with the agency is settled. Hayes, you know that." "I do," the deputy said, looking miserable. "But Collins is making it an official matter. He is talking about fraud. He says he is the one who brokered the deal and his reputation is at stake. He is putting a lot of pressure on the sheriff." "This woman is my guest and soon to be my wife," Eli said, his words clear and sharp, meant for anyone listening. "There is no fraud. There is only a man who enjoys the sound of his own voice. Now, if you will excuse us." He tipped his hat to May and guided Lila toward the general store, leaving the young deputy looking more conflicted than ever. On their way out of town, near the dry creek bed that gave the town its name, they saw a wagon with a broken wheel. A man and woman. Amos and Ruthie were struggling to fix it. A small calf lay in the back of the wagon, its breathing shallow, its head lolling to one side. Amos was a freedman, a blacksmith with hands as strong as the iron he worked, and his wife Ruthie was known throughout the territory as a gifted midwife. They were good, hard-working people, but in Dry River, the color of their skin meant they were often left to fend for themselves. Several riders had passed them by without offering a word of help. Lila saw the sick animal and did not hesitate. "Eli, stop," she said. She was out of the wagon before he had fully reined in the horses. She approached the other wagon slowly. Her hands held out where the calf could see them. "What is wrong with him?" she asked Ruthie. Ruthie, a woman with kind, weary eyes, looked up, surprised by the offer of concern. "We are not sure. He will not take water, and he is burning with fever." While Eli, without a word, went to help Amos lift the heavy wagon to fix the wheel. Lila gently examined the calf. Her touch was as sure and calming as it had been with Eli's filly. She ran her hands over its belly, felt the heat of its skin. "He has eaten something he should not have," she said after a moment. "His gut is twisted with it." She looked around at the sparse vegetation growing along the creek bed. Her eyes scanning the plants, she found what she was looking for, a tough, bitter-looking weed, and plucked a handful of leaves. She crushed them in her hands, then mixed them with a little water from her canteen to make a paste. "Hold his head steady," she told Ruthie. "Gently." She opened the calf's mouth and pushed the bitter medicine down its throat. Then she began to massage its stomach with a firm, rhythmic motion. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then, the calf gave a low groan and shuddered. It coughed, and then it slowly, unsteadily, struggled to its feet. Ruthie let out a cry of relief. Amos, having finished the wheel with Eli's help, stared in amazement. "I have never seen anything like that," he said, his deep voice filled with gratitude. "You have a gift, ma'am." "My father taught me," Lila said simply. Ruthie placed a hand on Lila's arm, her touch warm and sincere. "We have heard the whispers in town. Do not you mind them. We see what is true. We are in your debt." As they rode away, Eli looked at Lila with a new level of respect. She had not only saved the animal, but she had also crossed a social line to do it, offering help where others offered only indifference. She was building a community of her own, one based not on gossip but on action. The confrontation they had been avoiding came the next time they were in town. Ward Collins was waiting for them, standing on the boardwalk in front of his bank like a spider in the center of its web. "McRae!" he called out, his voice carrying down the dusty street. "A word, if you please." Eli reined in the wagon, his body tense. He and Lila sat as Collins approached, his thumbs hooked in his vest. "I have been reviewing your accounts," Collins said, his tone dripping with false concern. "The Circle M carries a significant mortgage with my bank, a mortgage I was happy to extend based on my belief in your stability and good character." He let his gaze slide over to Lila. "Recent events have forced me to question that stability. An arrangement built on a lie is no arrangement at all. Before the bank can consider the future of your loan, I must insist on inspecting the legal paperwork concerning your partnership. A marriage contract, for instance. One bearing the name Sarah Hart." The trap was sprung. It was elegant in its cruelty. He was using the ranch, Eli's entire life's work, as a weapon against them. If Eli admitted the truth, Collins could claim he had entered into a loan agreement under false pretenses and call in the debt. If he tried to bluff, he would be tangled in a web of fraud. Eli could feel the paper shackles of the bank's ledger tightening around him. "My arrangements are my own business, Collins," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Not when my money is at risk," Collins retorted with a smug smile. "The world runs on contracts. McRae, on names on a dotted line. I suggest you find the right one." He turned and walked back into his bank. confident that he had won. The ride back to the ranch was long and silent. The weight of Collins's threat settled over them, heavy and suffocating. That night, sitting at the simple plank table, Lila finally said what had been on her mind. "I should leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I have brought you nothing but trouble. Collins is using me to hurt you. If I am gone, he loses his leverage." Eli looked at her across the table. He saw the genuine sorrow in her eyes, the willingness to sacrifice her own safety for his. In the past weeks, he had seen her strength, her skill, her quiet courage. He had come to value her presence more than he had thought possible. Collins had miscalculated. He thought Lila was Eli's weakness. He was wrong. She was becoming his strength. "No," Eli said, his voice firm. "This fight was coming. One way or another. Collins wants my land. He has always wanted it. You are just the excuse he thinks he needs. If we back down now, we lose everything anyway." He stood up and began to pace the small room. "There is only one thing to do." He stopped and looked at her. His decision made. "We are riding back to town tomorrow. We are going to the church, and we are going to file for a marriage license with Reverend Jonah, and we will file it under your true name, Lila Hart." It was a declaration of war, a public act of defiance that would draw a line in the sand for the whole town to see. He was choosing her, the real her, over the lie. He was choosing to stand with her, regardless of the consequences. The next day, they found Reverend Jonah in his small, stuffy office behind the wooden church. He was a man who spoke of lions and faith on Sunday, but practiced the caution of a field mouse the rest of the week. When Eli stated their purpose, the Reverend's face grew troubled. "Eli, my son," he began, steepling his fingers. "I have heard the talk. In the interest of community harmony, perhaps it would be prudent to wait, to seek clarity. The only thing that needs to be clear, Reverend, is whether you will marry us or not," Eli said, his patience wearing thin. The Reverend sighed, clearly unwilling to take a stand that might offend the man who put the most money in the collection plate. "I will, of course," he said, "but I urge you to consider the repercussions." As they left the church, the bright sunlight seeming harsh after the dim interior, they saw Teddy, the telegraph boy, hurrying down the street. He was a skinny, freckle-faced boy with eyes that missed nothing. He saw Eli and Lila, and a look of boyish admiration crossed his face. He gave a quick nod before disappearing into the telegraph office. Inside Ward Collins's office, the banker was reviewing his ledgers. Teddy entered and handed him a freshly received telegram. Collins tore it open. As he read the coded message, a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. The telegram was from an associate in a town far to the east. It read, "Inquiry confirmed. Subject sought for abandonment. Instructions requested regarding the child." Collins folded the paper carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He now had the one piece of information he was sure would break them both. Eli and Lila were preparing to head back to the ranch when the air began to change. The sky to the west was turning a sickly yellow-brown. The wind, which had been a constant whisper, began to howl, picking up loose dirt and stinging sand, whipping it through the streets of Dry River. The townspeople scurried for cover, barring their doors and shuttering their windows. A sandstorm was bearing down on them, a massive, swirling wall of dust that promised to scour the landscape clean. Eli looked at Lila, her face set and determined as she pulled her bonnet tight. He pointed the wagon toward home, toward the coming storm. They would face this, just as they would face Collins. The wind rose to a deafening roar, a warning from the land itself that the real battle had just begun. When the wind blows against you, you find out who stands beside you, and as they rode into the teeth of the storm, Eli knew, without a doubt, who was standing with him. The storm did not arrive with the dignity of thunder or the grace of rain. It came as a brute, a roaring, smothering monster of grit and wind. The sky vanished, replaced by a churning wall of brown that swallowed the horizon, the sun, and then the ranch itself. The world shrank to a maelstrom of stinging sand and a wind that shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the logs of the cabin and threatening to rip the shingles from the roof of the barn. For hours that felt like days. Eli and Lila fought it. They were no longer a man and a woman, but two figures battling a furious, elemental god. Covered in burlap to protect their faces, they worked in a blinding, suffocating whirlwind. The fine, red dust filled their lungs, their eyes, their mouths. It was a physical assault, grinding and relentless. Their main concern was the herd, particularly the new calves, small and vulnerable against the storm's fury. The cattle, panicked by the noise and the stinging wind, bellowed and pressed against the corral fences, threatening to break through and scatter into the deadly brown chaos. They moved as a team, their words swallowed by the gale, communicating through instinct and gesture. Eli, with his raw strength, forced a path through the terrified animals, while Lila, with her surprising agility, darted it among them, guiding the frantic calves toward the relative safety of the barn. Twice, a calf broke away, a small, terrified shape disappearing into the swirling dust. Twice, they plunged in after it, tethered only by the sound of Eli's shouted directions and the desperate hope of finding the animal before it was lost for good. They found it huddled against a rock outcropping, and together, half carrying, half pushing, they wrestled it back to the barn, collapsing against the great wooden doors as they slammed them shut against the howling rage outside. By the time the last animal was secured, night had fallen, though it was impossible to tell where the storm ended and the darkness began. They stumbled back into the cabin, two exhausted figures caked in a thick layer of mud like creatures born of the earth itself. They were battered, their muscles screaming in protest, their faces chapped and raw. Inside, the silence was a physical presence, a stark contrast to the unending roar outside. The sand hissed against the window panes, a constant, abrasive whisper, but the sturdy log walls held. The world outside was wild and trying to break in, but inside, there was shelter. Eli built up the fire in the stove until the iron radiated a deep, penetrating warmth that began to chase the chill from their bones. They moved with the slow, deliberate motions of the utterly spent. They washed the grit from their faces and hands in the basin, the water turning to red mud. Lila tended to a long scratch on Eli's arm, her touch gentle and sure. He, in turn, noticed her slight limp and made her sit, examining her ankle with a quiet concern that needed no words. The shared ordeal had stripped away the last vestiges of formality between them. They were no longer a rancher and his mail-order bride. They were two people who had faced down a storm together and survived. Eli made a pot of strong coffee, its rich aroma filling the small cabin, a scent of civilization in the midst of the wilderness. He handed her a steaming mug, and their fingers brushed, a small spark, a simple human connection that felt monumental after the day's brutal struggle. They sat at the small plank table, the single oil lamp casting a pool of warm, golden light around them, their shadows long and dancing on the walls. For a long time, they just sat, sipping the hot coffee, listening to the wind. They had saved the herd. They had saved themselves. The relief was so profound it was almost as exhausting as the work itself. Eli looked at Lila in the soft lamplight. The dirt could not hide the fine lines of fatigue around her eyes, but it also could not diminish the unyielding strength he saw in their depths. He noticed her hand, resting on the table, was trembling. It was not from the cold. The stove had made the room warm. It was a deep, internal tremor, the aftershock of a fear that ran deeper than the storm. Without thinking, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough and calloused, but his touch was steady and warm. He did not say anything, just held her hand, offering a silent, solid anchor in the tumultuous night. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark, shimmering with unshed tears. The simple act of kindness seemed to break through the last of her defenses. She took a shuddering breath, and when she spoke, her voice was a raw, aching whisper, barely audible above the hissing sand. "Eli," she began, her gaze dropping to their joined hands, "there is something else, the biggest lie of all. I should have told you from the very beginning." He waited, his grip on her hand firm but gentle, giving her the time she needed. He could feel the terror coming off her in waves. "I was afraid," she whispered, her voice cracking. "So afraid of what you would think, of what you would do. I was afraid to lose the safety, your kindness." She took another shaky breath, forcing herself to meet his eyes. The confession came out in a painful rush, torn from the deepest part of her. "I have a daughter." The words hung in the warm air between them, more powerful and shocking than the raging storm outside. The secret she had carried for so long was finally free, and she braced herself for the impact, for the anger, the accusation, the cold withdrawal of his hand. She watched his face, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Her name is Rosita," she continued, the words tumbling out now that the first had been spoken. "She is 4 years old. She is safe. She is staying with Amos and Ruthie, under a different name. I brought her this far, but I could not bring her to you until I knew. I had to be sure. I was afraid I would lose you if I told you." Eli did not move. His expression was unreadable, his gray eyes searching hers. The silence stretched, each second an eternity for Lila. This was it, the moment her fragile new life would either shatter or become real. He had every right to feel betrayed, to cast her out for bringing such a complicated, dangerous truth to his door. He looked down at their hands, then back up at her face, and then the corner of his mouth twitched. A slow, gentle smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and filled them with a light she had never seen before. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated acceptance. He gave her hand a slight squeeze. He spoke slowly, his voice calm and certain, each word a stone being laid for the foundation of a new world. "Then we'll bring her home." The 3 simple words broke her. The tears she had been holding back for so long finally fell, silent tears of overwhelming relief that traced clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. He did not let go of her hand. He just sat there, a solid presence, letting her cry out the fear and the shame until it was all gone. After a long time, her tears subsided. Eli stood, walked to a wooden chest in the corner, and took out a thick wool blanket. He came back and draped it gently over her shoulders, tucking it around her. It was an embrace without touching, a promise of protection, an unspoken vow that he was now her shield against the storm, both outside and within. She pulled the blanket tighter, the rough wool a comforting weight. A watery smile touched her lips. "We probably should have mentioned that to Reverend Jonah." A low chuckle rumbled in Eli's chest. "He might have fainted. Guess we will need to build a small bed." "And you will have to practice your braiding," she said, her voice still thick with emotion but touched with a hint of their earlier humor. "A 4-year-old girl is a much tougher critic than a horse." "I reckon I can stand the judgment," he said, his smile still in place. The mood, though still heavy with the gravity of her confession, had shifted. They were no longer just Eli and Lila. They were a family, planning a future that now included a small child. But as the warmth of relief spread through Lila, a colder fear took its place. "There is more." "Eli," she said quietly, her newfound hope making the next words even harder to say. "My fear, it was not just about you. It is about Collins." Eli's smile faded, his expression hardening. "What about him?" "He knows about Rosita. I do not know how, but I am sure he does. That is why he is doing all of this. He is not just trying to get your land. He is trying to get to me. He sent a man looking for me before I left, asking questions. He has papers, forged documents saying I abandoned my child. He wants to use her, Eli, to control me, to take her from me." She told him about her husband, a kind man, a miner from Mexico, who had died in a cave leaving her alone and vulnerable. Collins had been his employer and had tried to take advantage of her situation from the moment he died. The full, monstrous scope of the banker's cruelty was laid bare in the lamplit cabin. This was not a matter of social prejudice or a land dispute anymore. It was a direct threat to a child. Eli's jaw was set like granite, a cold, dangerous fire lighting his eyes. He had faced down armed men in battle, but he had never felt a fury like the one that was building in him now. He looked at Lila, her face pale but resolute under the blanket. He had chosen to stand with this woman. Now he knew that choice meant standing between a little girl he had never met and a man who would destroy them all to get what he wanted. To love her, he now understood, was to choose to be brave in a way he had never imagined. The storm howled outside, but inside the small cabin, the true fight had just been defined. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were fighting for a family. The morning after the sandstorm was a world reborn. The air, scrubbed clean of dust, was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of spring. The sky was a high, brilliant blue. The fury of the previous day had passed, leaving behind a landscape that felt both battered and cleansed. Inside the cabin, a decision made in the heart of the storm had settled into a quiet, unshakable resolve. They were going to get Lila's daughter. Eli moved with a renewed purpose. He packed supplies not for a simple trip to town, but for a journey through uncertain territory. He chose their mounts carefully, his own sturdy gray for himself, and a sure-footed mare for Lila. He also haltered a third horse, a spirited but gentle yearling filly, to trail behind them. Lila worked beside him, her movements quick and efficient, her face a mask of anxious hope. Every glance she cast toward the distant hills was filled with a mother's fierce, desperate love. They did not take the main wagon road. Collins would be watching it. Instead, Eli led them north, into the broken country of foothills and hidden canyons, a landscape he knew as well as the lines on his own hand. The spring thaw was in full force. The streams and creeks that were mere trickles a week ago were now swollen, fast-moving ribbons of icy water fed by the melting snows in the high mountains. The ground was soft, and their horses' hooves sank into the mud, making the travel slow and arduous. On the second day, they came to a deep ravine spanned by an old, rickety wooden bridge. The creek below was a churning, brown torrent, and the bridge itself looked like a collection of rotten teeth. Half the planks were missing, and the ones that remained were slick with moss and spray. "We have to cross," Eli said, his voice grim as he studied the torrent. Going around would add a day to the journey. He dismounted and led his gray onto the bridge first, testing each plank before putting the horse's weight on it. He was halfway across when a rotted timber groaned, splintered, and gave way beneath him. The horse shrieked, scrambling for purchase as its hind legs slipped off the edge. Eli was thrown from the saddle, his body twisting, and he only saved himself from plunging into the raging water by grabbing hold of a support beam, his legs dangling over the abyss. Lila screamed his name. For a heart-stopping second, she was paralyzed by terror, but then the training of a lifetime took over. She saw Eli's horse, wild-eyed and panicked, its struggles threatening to tear the rest of the bridge apart. Instead of running to Eli, she spoke to the horse, her voice a low, commanding calm that cut through the animal's fear. "Easy now. Easy, boy. Stand." She dismounted and, keeping her voice in that steady, hypnotic rhythm, she slowly approached the terrified animal. She took its reins and pulled, not with force, but with a firm, confident pressure, guiding it back onto the more solid part of the bridge. The horse, trusting her calm authority over its own panic, obeyed. With the animal secured, She tied its reins and her own to a sturdy post. Only then did she turn her attention back to Eli. He was struggling to pull himself up, his boots finding no purchase on the slick, vertical beams. He was strong, but the weight of his body was a dead pull on his straining arms. "Lila?" he grunted, his knuckles white. "The rope, on my saddle." She worked quickly, her hands sure as she uncoiled the lariat. She fashioned a loop and, leaning as far out as she dared, tossed it down to him. It fell short. The wind caught the next throw. On the third try, the loop settled over his shoulders. He worked it under his arms, and she pulled the rope taut, bracing her feet against the solid timbers. She was not strong enough to pull him up on her own, but she could provide the anchor he needed. "Use the horses," she called out. She untied the reins and, walking them backward step by painstaking step, used their immense strength to take the strain. With the rope holding his weight, Eli was able to find a foothold and haul himself, scraped and dripping, back onto the bridge. He collapsed onto the solid ground of the far bank, breathing heavily, his heart hammering against his ribs. Lila knelt beside him, her face pale, her hands trembling now that the danger was past. He looked at her, at the raw courage and clear-headed thinking that had just saved his life. She had not panicked. She had seen the whole problem, man and beast, and had solved it with a skill that left him breathless. He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dirt. "You have a habit of saving my livestock," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Seems you have added me to the list." She gave him a watery smile. "You are the heaviest calf I have had to rescue so far." The moment passed, but it left something permanent in its place. The last wall between them had crumbled. They were no longer two separate people facing a problem. They were a single unit, bound by shared risk and a deep, unspoken trust. Their path eventually led them back toward the main trail at a place where an old, defunct ferry crossing made a natural choke point. As they approached, hidden by a stand of cottonwoods, Eli saw them, two of Colin's men, lounging by the riverbank, their rifles held carelessly across their laps. They were watching the road. Eli pulled them back into the trees. "We cannot get past them," he whispered, just as despair began to set in. A lone rider approached the crossing from the direction of town. It was Deputy Hayes. He rode up to the two men, and they spoke for a few moments. Hayes pointed back down the trail, his gestures animated. The two men looked annoyed, but they mounted their horses and rode off in the direction the deputy had indicated. Hayes watched them go, then turned his horse and slowly rode away, never once looking toward the cottonwood grove. He had seen them, and he had sent their pursuers on a wild goose chase. The young deputy, it seemed, had chosen his side. They crossed the river without incident and rode on, a new, fragile hope buoying their spirits. They arrived at Amos and Ruthie's homestead as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. The place was a small pocket of peace, a tidy cabin and a sturdy barn nestled in a valley that protected it from the worst of the wind. A small garden was already showing green shoots, and the sound of chickens clucking filled the air. As they dismounted, a small girl with big, dark eyes and a cascade of black curls came running out of the cabin, chasing a fluffy white puppy. She stopped short when she saw them, her expression one of sober curiosity, not fear. "Mama Lila," she cried, and ran into Lila's outstretched arms. Lila buried her face in her daughter's hair, holding her tight, her whole body trembling with the force of her love. Eli stood back, giving them their moment. He felt like an intruder, a stranger at the edge of a sacred circle. This was the child he had promised to bring home, a living, breathing person who held the power to change his entire world. Lila eventually stood, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. "Rosita," she said, her voice soft. "This is Mr. McRae, Eli." Rosita looked up at the tall, quiet man. She tilted her head, her gaze direct and unnervingly perceptive. Eli felt a sudden, awkward helplessness. He did not know how to talk to children. He knelt down, so he was closer to her level. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Rosita," he said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet evening. Rosita did not answer. Instead, she took a step forward, reached out a tiny hand, and placed it flat on his chest, right over his heart. She stood there for a long moment, her small face serious with concentration. "Bum-bum," she said, her eyes wide with discovery. She looked up at him, a radiant smile breaking across her face. "It is strong, like a horse." In that moment, something inside Eli McRae shifted. The hard, lonely places in his heart, fortified by years of loss and solitude, began to crumble. He felt a wave of protectiveness so fierce it almost took his breath away. He gently lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, but infinitely more precious. He then turned to the young filly he had brought. "This is for you," he told Rosita, setting her down. "Her name is Hope. It will be your job to take care of her." Rosita's eyes lit up, and she ran to the small horse, her earlier caution forgotten in her delight. That night, after a simple, wonderful meal with Amos and Ruthie, and after Rosita had been tucked into a small cot, the three adults sat around the hearth, here, in this safe place. Lila finally told Eli everything. She spoke of her sister Sarah's long illness, of their shared dream of a better life, and of the innocent deception of the letters that had grown out of desperation. She told him of her late husband, Miguel, a good and gentle man killed in a mine collapse, a mine owned by Ward Collins. She spoke of Collins' predatory advances after Miguel's death, and the fear that had driven her to run, to protect her daughter at any cost. The story poured out of her, a long, painful confession that washed away the last of the secrets. When she finished, she sat in the firelight, her hands clasped in her lap, waiting for his judgment. Eli listened to it all without interruption. He looked at this woman who had endured so much, who had fought so hard, who had risked everything for her child. He saw not a liar, but a survivor. He saw not a burden, but a woman of incredible strength and integrity. He reached out and took her hand, his touch conveying everything he could not say. "The past is dust," he said, his voice low and certain. "The future is the roof we build together." The journey back to the Circle M was a quiet pilgrimage of hope, with Rosita riding in front of Lila, her small voice a constant, happy chatter about her new filly. The silence that had once defined Eli's world was filled with a new and wonderful music. They rode not as three separate people, but as a family, a small, fragile unit moving across the vast landscape toward a home that was finally beginning to feel complete. As they crested the last ridge overlooking the ranch, the familiar shapes of the cabin and barn came into view. But something was wrong. A lazy, dark pillar of smoke was rising into the clear blue sky, a foul stain against the morning's purity. Eli's body went rigid in the saddle. He spurred his horse forward, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Lila followed, her hand instinctively tightening on Rosita's shoulder. They galloped into the yard and were met with a scene of black, smoldering devastation. The hay barn, the one they had worked so hard to fill against the coming winter, was gone. All that remained was a smoking skeleton of charred timbers and a mountain of blackened, ruined hay. Lila let out a small, choked cry. Rosita buried her face in her mother's side, frightened by the acrid smell and the terrible sight. Eli dismounted, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He walked the perimeter of the ruin, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the deep, deliberate boot prints in the soft earth, a trail leading not from the road, but from the direction of the open range, toward the sprawling lands owned by Ward Collins. This was not an accident. It was a message, written in ash and smoke. The news of the fire traveled through Dry River on the wind. The town, which had been a quiet battlefield of whispers, now became a place of open warfare. People were forced to choose a side. Those indebted to Collins or fearful of his power echoed his narrative that the fire was a stroke of bad luck, or perhaps even a sign that the McRae place was tainted by deceit. But a new, stronger voice was also rising. May, from her boarding house, spoke loudly and often of Lila's good character. Amos and Ruthie, their faces grim, told the story of the saved calf to anyone who would listen, a testament to Lila's skill and kindness. The fire had not just destroyed a barn, it had ignited the conscience of the community. Collins, however, was not a man to be swayed by conscience. He saw the fire as an opportunity. He rode out to the ranch 2 days later, not with condolences, but with a smug, predatory look in his eye. He was accompanied by the town's sheriff, a man who had long since become a puppet on Collins' string. "A terrible tragedy, McRae," Collins said, his voice slick with false sympathy as he surveyed the damage. "A financial blow from which a man might not recover. It forces the bank's hand. You understand? We must protect our investment." He produced a sheaf of papers. "I am petitioning the circuit judge. We will have a hearing to determine the legal status of your loan, given these unfortunate circumstances." "And," he added, his gaze falling on Lila and Rosita, who stood on the cabin porch, "we will also settle the matter of this woman's fraudulent contract and the irregular custody of her child." It was a declaration of total war. He was coming for the ranch, for Lila, and for Rosita, all at once, using the law as his cudgel. The hearing was set for the following week, in the makeshift courtroom above the general store. The room was small and stiflingly hot, packed with the people of Dry River. The air was thick with tension. On one side sat Collins with his lawyer, looking confident and serene. On the other sat Eli, Lila, and Rosita. The little girl, dressed in her best frock, sat between them, her small hand clutching Lila's. Behind them, a small but solid block of supporters had gathered May, Amos, Ruthie, and to everyone's surprise, Reverend Jonah. The minister's face was pale, but his jaw was set with a new and unfamiliar resolve. The circuit judge was a stern, weary-looking man named Thompson, who looked as though he had seen every form of human folly and was impressed by none of it. He called the room to order, and Collins's lawyer began. He painted a picture of Ward Collins as a pillar of the community, a benevolent banker who had been taken advantage of by a desperate woman and a foolish rancher. He presented the forged papers from back east, documents that spoke of abandonment and moral failings, making Lila out to be an unfit mother. He spoke of contracts and legal obligations, twisting the law into a weapon to dispossess and condemn. When it was Eli's turn, he did not call a lawyer. He stood himself, his presence filling the small room. He spoke simply, without rhetoric, about the agreement he had made, about the work Lila had done, and about the threats Collins had made. But he knew words were not enough. "Your Honor," Eli said, his voice steady, "Mr. Collins speaks of contracts. I would like to present a document of my own." He held up a flimsy piece of paper. It was a copy of a telegram. A murmur went through the crowd. "This is a message sent by Mr. Collins to an associate in the East, asking him to find leverage concerning Lila Hart and a child. It seems his concern for the law is very recent." Collins's face flushed a dangerous purple. "This is an outrage, a violation of my privacy." Teddy, the telegraph boy, sat near the back of the room, looking terrified but resolute. He had slipped Eli the copy that morning, telling him that a man's character was not for sale, no matter how powerful he was. The judge examined the telegram, his expression unreadable. The document did not prove anything definitively, but it planted a seed of doubt, showing that Collins's motives were far from pure. The banker's lawyer began to object, his voice rising in indignation, and the legal arguments grew heated and complex. The room became a pressure cooker of accusation and defense. And then, a small voice cut through the noise. "I am scared of the fire," Rosita said, her voice trembling. She was not looking at the judge or at Collins. She was looking at Reverend Jonah, pulling on the sleeve of his black coat. "Please, sir, tell them not to make any more fire." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to the small child. Her simple, terrified words had done what no legal argument could. They had stripped away the layers of contracts and lies and exposed the raw, human heart of the conflict. This was not about mortgages or names on a paper. It was about a little girl who was afraid of being burned out of her home. Reverend Jonah looked down at Rosita, and something in the minister's face seemed to break. The fear, the caution, the desire to please the powerful, all of it fell away, replaced by a shame so profound it was painful to watch. He gently patted her hand and then stood, his voice shaking but clear. "Your Honor," he said, "I have been a coward. I have preached of righteousness while allowing wickedness to flourish in my own town out of fear. This family," he said, looking at Eli and Lila, "has shown more Christian charity and courage in a few weeks than I have shown in years. They are good people." Before Collins could erupt, Lila stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She looked directly at Judge Thompson, her dignity a shield and a sword. "My name is Lila Hart," she began, her voice clear and steady. "My sister, Sarah, is gone. I came here to honor a promise she could not keep. My husband, Miguel, is also gone, killed in a mine owned by that man." She pointed a single, unwavering finger at Ward Collins. "When I refused his advances, he tried to take my daughter. I ran to protect her. Everything I have done to protect my child. I am not a swindler. I am a mother." She spoke of the burned barn, of her fear for her child's safety, of Eli's unwavering honor in the face of lies. She laid the truth out for the whole town to see. A simple, unadorned story that was more powerful than any of Collins's legal maneuvering. The crowd was silent, their faces a mixture of shame, pity, and a dawning respect. The tide of opinion, which had been turning slowly, now rushed in like a flood. Just as the judge was about to speak, Deputy Hayes pushed his way to the front of the courtroom, his face pale and grim. He was holding another piece of paper. "Your Honor," he said, his voice ringing with newfound authority, "I think you need to see this." He handed the telegram to the judge. It had arrived only moments ago. Teddy had intercepted it and, his courage bolstered by the events in the courtroom, had run to find the deputy. Judge Thompson read it, and his weary face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He looked up, his gaze fixing on Ward Collins, a look that could have frozen fire. He read the telegram aloud, his voice like the crack of a whip. "Hay barn destroyed as instructed, awaiting payment and further orders. It is signed by a man known to be in your employ, Mr. Collins." A collective gasp went through the room. It was the final, undeniable proof. The smoking gun. Collins stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, his carefully constructed world collapsing into a pile of ash around him. Judge Thompson slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing the finality of a closing coffin. "This hearing is adjourned," he declared, his voice booming in the small room. "I am placing the Circle M Ranch and the custody of the child Rosita Hart under the temporary protection of this court. Mr. Collins, you will be held for investigation on charges of arson, conspiracy, and witness intimidation. Deputy, take this man into custody." For a moment, no one moved. Then, the people of Dry River, the same ones who had whispered and judged, began to part, clearing a path for Eli, Lila, and their daughter. They left the courtroom and stepped out into the bright sunlight, the weight of the past weeks finally beginning to lift. The fight was not over, but the law, which for so long had seemed like a weapon against them, had finally, slowly, begun to bend toward justice. Ward Collins was not a man who accepted defeat. To him, the judge's ruling was not the end of the matter. It was a personal insult, an intolerable tear in the fabric of the world he controlled. While the town saw justice, Collins saw only the need for a more brutal form of persuasion. He paid his bond with a sneer and, under the cover of darkness, gathered the last of his loyal, paid men. The circuit judge's final. Binding orders were being carried by a court-martial due to arrive in 2 days. Collins's plan was simple and savage. The marshal would never reach Dry River. But the world had other plans. A strange, unnatural chill began to seep into the air. A cold that had no place in the late spring. The sky, which had been a clear, hopeful blue, turned to a leaden gray. A hard, biting wind rose from the north, carrying not the scent of rain, but the sharp, sterile smell of ice. A freak blizzard, a white monster of a storm, was descending from the high peaks, threatening to bury the territory in a thick blanket of snow. The news of Collins's plan reached Eli through a breathless Teddy, who had overheard the men talking near the saloon. At the same time, the first flakes of snow, large and wet, began to drift from the sky. The 2 storms, one of the man's making and one of nature's, were about to converge. There was no time for deliberation. Eli knew the route the marshal would take, through a narrow, winding canyon that was a perfect spot for an ambush. He had to ride. He looked at Lila, who was already herding a frightened Rosita toward the warmth of the cabin. "I have to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Hayes is meeting me. We have to make sure that marshal gets through." Lila's face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She understood. "Take Rosita to Maze," she said, her voice firm. "She will be safe there." "No," Eli said, placing his hands on her shoulders. "People will be looking for shelter. They will come here. The Circle M is the safest place for miles in a storm like this. They will need you." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "I need you to be the strong place. Lila, keep the light on." He knelt and hugged Rosita, a fierce, protective embrace. "You be a brave girl for your mama," he whispered into her hair. He then entrusted her to Lila, a silent transfer of all that was precious in his world. He and Lila shared one last look, a look that said everything that could not be spoken. Then he turned, pulled his hat down low against the driving snow, and rode out to meet Deputy Hayes. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a white, roaring chaos. The snow came down not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet, driven by a wind that howled with the voice of a predator. As Eli had predicted, people began to arrive at the Circle M, families from smaller, more exposed homesteads, their wagons struggling through the mounting drifts, their face numb with cold and fear. Lila, with the help of Ruthie, who had arrived early, turned the cabin into a sanctuary. She put coffee on the stove, handed out blankets, and offered a calm, reassuring presence that was an anchor in the storm. Just as the last light was failing, a final, desperate wagon appeared through the blizzard, carrying a small party of settlers who had become lost on the trail. One of them, a young woman named Mary, was in the throes of a difficult labor. Her husband, a boy himself, was frantic with terror. Immediately, the warm kitchen became an infirmary. The women cleared the big plank table while the men were sent to the barn to care for the exhausted horses. Lila's voice was the calmest in the room. She was no longer the outsider, the mail-order bride with a secret. She was the one in command, her knowledge and compassion a beacon of hope in the swirling darkness. The townspeople, who had once whispered about her, now looked to her with a mixture of awe and desperate trust. Miles away, in the wind-scoured throat of Beartooth Canyon, the storm was a weapon. Eli and Hayes, their faces covered with scarves, lay behind a frozen outcropping of rock, the snow piling up around them. They could barely see 10 feet in front of them, but they could hear the nervous stamping of horses further down the canyon. Collins and his 4 men were there, waiting. "We cannot face them head-on," Hayes shouted over the wind, his voice muffled by his scarf. "They will cut us down before we even see them." Eli's eyes, narrowed against the stinging snow, scanned the terrain. An idea, born of his years on the range, began to form. Above them, on a high ledge, he had earlier seen a small herd of his own cattle, huddled together for warmth, their bells clanking softly in the wind. "Sound," Eli yelled. "In this whiteout, sound is everything. We are going to give them something else to listen to." While Hayes kept watch, Eli made a long, perilous climb up the slick, snow-covered rocks. He moved with the quiet stealth of a hunter, the wind covering any sound he made. He reached the herd, and, with a series of low calls and a well-thrown rock, he spooked them. The cattle, already on edge from the storm, bolted, plunging down a narrow cut that led directly into the canyon floor, a river of brown hides and clanging bells pouring through the blizzard. The ambushers, startled by the sudden, deafening noise and the sight of a stampede erupting from the white void, were thrown into confusion. They fired their rifles wildly at the shapes moving in the snow. This was the moment Eli and Hayes had been waiting for. Under the cover of the chaos, they moved, firing with deadly accuracy from their protected position. 2 of Collins's men went down. The other 2, seeing their companions fall and their employer in a panic, lost their nerve and fled, disappearing back into the blizzard. In the cabin, Mary's labor was reaching its crisis. The baby was turned, and her strength was failing. Her husband wept in a corner, and a palpable fear settled over the room. But Lila remained calm. She spoke to Mary in a low, soothing voice, her hands firm and knowing. She worked with Ruthie, their movements a practiced, seamless dance. The whole room seemed to be holding its breath, the only sounds the moaning of the young woman and the relentless howl of the wind outside. Back in the canyon, the stampede had passed. An eerie silence fell, broken only by the wind. Eli and Hayes advanced cautiously through the snow. They found Collins, unhorsed, his leg twisted beneath him where his panicked mount had thrown him. He was trying to reload his pistol, his face a mask of insane rage. He saw Eli and raised the gun, his hand shaking. "This is your fault, McRae!" he shrieked, his voice thin against the gale. Before he could fire, Hayes threw himself in front of Eli. The gunshot was a flat, ugly crack in the frozen air. Hayes grunted and staggered back, a dark stain spreading across the front of his coat. As Collins tried to cock the pistol for another shot, Eli lunged. He was not a soldier anymore. He was a force of nature, as furious as the storm around him. He slammed into Collins, and the 2 men went down in a flurry of snow and fists. The fight was short and brutal. Eli, his face like stone, disarmed Collins and subdued him, his rage held in check by a cold, hard discipline. He would not kill this man. He would bring him to justice. At that exact moment, in the warm, lamp-lit cabin, Lila gave a final, firm instruction. Mary gave one last, desperate push, and then a new sound filled the room, thin and fragile but more powerful than the storm. The cry of a healthy newborn baby. A collective sigh of relief went through the room as Lila cleaned the infant and placed it in its mother's waiting arms. The townspeople looked at Lila, her face glowing with perspiration and triumph, and they saw a miracle worker. They saw a hero. As dawn broke, the storm broke with it, the wind died down, and the snow stopped, leaving a world transformed, buried in a deep, silent blanket of white. The sun rose on a scene of profound peace. Eli, half carrying the wounded but conscious Hayes, rode into the ranch yard, leading a horse on which a bound and defeated Ward Collins was slumped. The townspeople came out of the cabin, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and awe. They saw the captured villain, the wounded deputy, and the exhausted but triumphant rancher. And from inside the cabin, they could hear the cry of new life. Collins was brought into the now crowded room, his face a sullen mask of defeat. The sheriff, who had arrived with the townsfolk, began his questioning, but Collins remained stubbornly silent, his eyes filled with hate. Then Rosita, who had been sleeping soundly through the ordeal's end, came out from the bedroom, rubbing her eyes. She saw the angry, defeated man sitting in the chair. She walked over to him, unafraid. She looked at his bound hands, then up at his face. She reached out her small hand and gently touched his. "Mister," she said, her voice clear and sweet in the quiet room, "please do not burn anything else." The words, so simple, so innocent, shattered the last of Ward Collins's defenses. He stared at the child's trusting face, and for the first time, he saw not a pawn or an obstacle, but the reflection of his own lost humanity. A great, shuddering sob escaped him, and he confessed everything, not to the sheriff, but to the quiet, stunned room. He spoke of the fire, the ambush, the depth of his own greed and cruelty, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of shame. True strength, Eli realized as he looked from the crying baby to his future wife, was not in defeating an enemy. It was in preserving life, in building a community, in keeping a light burning against the storm. The thaw that followed the blizzard was as much a thing of the spirit as of the season, as the deep snow melted under a forgiving sun, revealing the tender green shoots of new grass. The cold grip of fear and suspicion that had held Dry River also began to recede. The law, when it finally moved, was swift and decisive. Judge Thompson returned, and his verdicts were like a strong wind clearing away the last of the storm clouds. Ward Collins, stripped of his power and influence, was a diminished figure in the courtroom. His properties, including the bank and the saloon, were seized by the federal government to pay his substantial debts and the fines levied against him for his crimes. A portion of the seized assets was designated to pay off the predatory mortgage on the Circle M, freeing Eli from the paper shackles that had bound him for so long. The judge formally nullified any contracts Collins had brokered, declared the marriage of Eli McRae and Lila Hart to be legal and valid, and granted them full and undisputed custody of their daughter, Rosita. The name Lila Hart was entered into the town record not as a mark of shame, but as a symbol of resilience. But the true healing did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in the days and weeks that followed, under the wide Wyoming sky. One morning, a line of wagons appeared on the trail to the Circle M. It was not a threat, but an offering. Led by Amos, the men of Dry River, even some who had once turned their backs on Eli and Lila, arrived with tools in their hands and lumber in their wagons. They had come to rebuild the burned hay barn. There was no grand speech, no formal apology. There was only the shared work, the sounds of saws and hammers echoing in the clean spring air. May arrived with a wagon full of food and drink, setting up a long trestle table and turning the barn raising into a town celebration. Reverend Jonah, his face humble and his sleeves rolled up, worked harder than any of them, as if trying to build his own penance with every nail he drove. The women of the town, who had once eyed Lila with suspicion, now gathered around her, listening as she spoke with Ruthie about herbs and remedies, their initial curiosity turning into genuine respect. Deputy Hayes, his arm in a sling but his back straight, came out to oversee the work. Though his title was now sheriff, the old sheriff had quietly retired, unable to face the town he had failed to protect. Hayes, with his quiet integrity, had been the unanimous choice to replace him. He was still young, but the events in the canyon had forged him into a man of quiet authority, his integrity as solid as the mountains on the horizon. Life at the Circle M settled into a new, richer rhythm. The silence Eli had once known was replaced by the sound of Rosita's laughter as she chased butterflies in the yard, her filly Hope trotting faithfully at her heels. The ranch became a stopping point for travelers, a place known for its open kitchen where a hot meal and a kind word were always available. Eli, his heart opened by his new family, found he enjoyed the company. He even hired a new hand, a quiet man with haunted eyes who had once ridden with a rough crowd. Eli, more than anyone, understood that a man deserved a second chance to build a better life. Lila, in turn, found her true calling. She became Ruthie's devoted student, learning the deeper arts of healing and midwifery. The two women planned to establish a small infirmary at the ranch, a place where the people of the high plains could come for aid, miles from the nearest doctor. Her hands, which had once written deceptive letters out of fear, were now dedicated to bringing comfort and life into the world. The whispers against her did not vanish entirely, for prejudice dies a slow death, but they became faint and irrelevant, drowned out by the growing chorus of respect and gratitude. One warm summer evening, as a soft purple twilight settled over the plains, the family sat together on the newly built porch of the cabin. A new wagon train of settlers had passed through that day, their faces filled with the same mixture of hope and trepidation that had once been on Lila's. They had stopped at the Circle M for water and advice, and Lila had spent an hour teaching the women how to identify medicinal plants, while Eli had shown the men how to track game in the dry country. Rosita, now the confident mistress of a small herd of foals sired by Eli's best stallion, had proudly shown the settler children how to care for their horses. Dry River was no longer just a stop on the map. It was becoming a place of sanctuary. Now, in the quiet of the evening, the air was filled with the scent of honeysuckle and the gentle chirping of crickets. Inside the cabin, a warm light glowed from the oil lamp, illuminating the dinner table where 3 plates had been cleared away. The promise made on a stormy night to bring a daughter home was now a simple, beautiful reality. Rosita was asleep in her new bed, a small wooden frame Eli had built with his own hands. Eli sat on the top step of the porch, leaning against a post, a cup of coffee held loosely in his hands. Lila sat beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. She reached up and placed her ear against his chest, just as Rosita had done that first day. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. Bum-bum. Strong, like a horse. But it was not the strength of a wild, untamed thing. It was the strength of a safe harbor, of a home. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost a part of the evening breeze, "for everything." He looked down at her, his rugged face softened by the twilight. A gentle smile touched his lips. "Just keeping a promise," he said. He reached up and gently touched the neat braid she had woven into her own hair that morning. "Your braiding has improved." She laughed, a low, happy sound. "So has yours. I have noticed, but Rosita still says mine is better." "She is a tough critic," he admitted with a mock sigh. "Tomorrow, we are having an emergency lesson. We need to master the art of the pigtail." They sat in a comfortable silence, watching as the first stars began to appear in the vast, dark sky. Just then, they heard the sound of an approaching rider. It was the boy who now carried the mail, and he had a letter for them. Its postmark from a city far to the east. Eli lit a lamp and opened it. His eyes scanned the page, and a look of surprise, followed by a slow, proud smile, crossed his face. "Well, what do you know?" he said, handing the letter to Lila. It was from a wealthy horse breeder. He had heard tales, carried by travelers along the Union Pacific, of a line of fine, spirited horses being raised at the Circle M ranch. He was particularly interested in a filly named Hope, tended to by a small girl with a special gift for animals. He wanted to buy 2 of her foals. The future, which had once been a terrifying, unknown country, was now a wide, open pasture, full of possibility. Lila finished the letter and looked at Eli, her eyes shining. Happiness in the West was not a loud, boisterous thing. It was not the clang of gold or the roar of a boomtown. It was this, a quiet evening on a porch, a sleeping child safe in her bed, a partner by your side, and the peace of a home built not just with logs and nails, but with courage, kindness, and love. It was the simple, profound joy of a warm meal and a door that no longer needed to be locked. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.